Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. Please use hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. Once again, we would love to connect with you. So on Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR, and on Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. The webinar will begin shortly. It will be recorded and shared with you afterwards. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be behind the scenes helping to produce this webinar. I have just a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself by posting in the chat box. So please put your name, city, or state in the chat box, and be sure to select both panelists and attendees when sharing so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box, which we will dedicate the last portion of the webinar to answer as well. This webinar is being recorded and it will be shared and made available to all who registered. And we will be sharing all of the resources that you see shared in the chat box as well in a follow-up email to all of the webinar registrants. Lastly, we will be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during Q&A and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Lastly, before we start, I would just like to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Next week on April 20th, we have a double header. Building on the American Rescue Plan, What's Next for Reducing Child Poverty at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a funder-to-funder conversation. At 3 p.m. that same day, we will have $22 billion for after school and summer, realizing the opportunity for communities. On April 27th, co-sponsored by EdWeek, we will have a Learning Loss Recovery Challenge webinar entitled The Fall Classroom, What the Data Imply About Composition, Challenges, and Opportunities. Finally, on Tuesday, May 4th, we will have a co-sponsored Learning Loss Recovery Challenge again, this time with the Overdeck Family Foundation, titled Technology to Accelerate Learning, Tech-Enabled Solutions to Address Learning Loss. We will post links in the chat box for registration information for these upcoming learning opportunities, and we hope you will join us. Joining you now is Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Great, thank you, Sierra. Welcome and thank you all for joining us for today's GLR Learning Tuesdays webinar. ARPA bets big on accelerating learning loss recovery. Today, we delve into what many are calling an unprecedented opportunity to provide millions of students across the nation the supports needed to make up for lost instructional time due to a year of interrupted learning as a result of COVID. This $160 billion opportunity made available through the American Rescue Plan for our K-12 education system and for childcare calls on all of us to be extremely thoughtful and strategic, to make sure that our decisions at the state and local levels are not used to do more of the same, but are invested wisely, responsibly, and boldly. You know, many of us have worked tirelessly for decades to close the long-standing equity gaps in education for kids from economically challenged families and kids of color, gaps that we now know were exacerbated by the pandemic. And now we've been given this moment. How will we choose to lead? And how will we use this moment and these resources to make things right for so many children? These are the questions that we will explore in today's conversation. So without further delay, I'm pleased to introduce and welcome our panel, starting with our moderator for today, my good friend and colleague, John Gompertz. John Gompertz is a senior fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. John is a longtime leader in nonprofits and government organizations devoted to civic engagement and to creating greater opportunity for children and youth. From 2012 to 2020, John served as president and CEO of America's Promise Alliance. Prior to that, John served as the director of AmeriCorps in the Obama administration and previously worked in the US Senate. So John, thank you for being our moderator, for joining us. I'll hand it to you in just a moment. Let me now turn to our panel and introduce them. So first we have John B. King Jr., the president and CEO of the Education Trust, a national nonprofit organization that seeks to identify and close educational opportunity gaps and achievement gaps. King served as US Secretary of Education in the Obama administration. Prior to that role, King carried out the duties of Deputy Secretary, overseeing policies and programs related to P-12 education, English learners, special education, innovation, and agency operations. King began his career as a high school social studies teacher and a middle school principal. King is also the founder of Strong Future Maryland, a progressive advocacy organization working to advance a more just and equitable future for Maryland. So welcome, John B. King Jr. Next is Mike Johnston. Mike Johnston is the president and CEO of Gary Community Investments, which uses nonprofit and for-profit investments to transform the lives of low-income children in Colorado. Mike began his career as a teacher in rural Mississippi with Teach for America, which inspired him to write his acclaimed book, In the Deep Heart's Core. Previously, Mike was a senior education policy advisor to Barack Obama and was elected to 2 terms in the Colorado State Senate from 2009 to 2017. Welcome to Mike. Next is Patricia Levesque. Patricia served as Governor Jeb Bush's Deputy Chief of Staff for Education, Enterprise Solutions for Government, Minority Procurement, and Business and Professional Regulation. Previously, Patricia served 6 years in the Florida legislature in the Speaker's office and as Staff Director of Education Policy. Welcome, Patricia. And last but not least is Dr. Ellen Pratt. Dr. Ellen Pratt is the Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association. He has served in this role for 5 years. The focus of his work is providing a unified voice for rural schools and communities. His work in the past has been in the areas of workforce development, school reform, professional learning communities, and rural education initiatives. So welcome to our entire panel. John, I turn it over to you again on behalf of the campaign. Thank you for joining and serving as our moderator. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Yoli, and thanks to the campaign, and thanks to the hundreds of people who've joined. I think we're going to have a really good conversation today. Look, everywhere you turn, people are talking about, oh my gosh, there's really a lot of challenge and there's really a lot of money. And how are we going to get this right? And I'm hoping that this conversation with a terrific group of panelists is going to help people in communities across the country in how to think about what the challenges we have today and the opportunity that lies before us. Here's how this is going to go. I'm going to ask John 1 or 2 questions at the top of the show to sort of set the table. I'm going to draw in the panelists at various points and come back to John. So we're going to make this as much like a conversation as possible with the limitations that this delightful technology imposes on all of us. So with that, Welcome, John, and thanks so much for joining. It's great to see you. I wish I could actually see you in person, even though we're just a few miles apart. I'm really glad you're here with us today and helping guide this conversation and provide some insights to folks around the country who are listening. Let's just start with this, a little thumbnail of what's in this package, what's in the recovery plan for education specifically, and are there other things that might pertain to the circumstances in which kids live that are relevant as well. So overall, what's here? And then as we think about pre-K through, say, third grade, what would you focus in on?
Sure.
And welcome. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to see you, John, and grateful to Yoli and the campaign for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. You know, the American Rescue Plan, I think, is an important step forward because it both responds to all the challenges that COVID has presented and gives us an opportunity, I think, to build towards a more just, more equitable future in education. You know, it responds to the huge equity challenges that COVID has exacerbated. In the early childhood space, there are very important investments really to save the sector. What we've seen in the country with COVID is lots of early childhood providers having to close, huge financial challenges for the sector. So in the American Rescue Plan, there is very significant investment, additional investment in Head Start, $1 billion. There's $15 billion for the Childcare and Development Block Grant Program. There's $24 billion to try to stabilize the childcare sector, as well as funding focused on serving students with disabilities in an early childhood context. Those are hugely important resources that will help us stabilize the sector. I would say I hope there is more coming, and I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will put forward a care infrastructure plan that has more investment. I believe we ought to get to universal access to high quality early childhood 0 to 4, but this is a good start on trying to stabilize the sector. From a K-12 perspective, there are resources here to help schools safely reopen, hugely important.
Mm-hmm.
There are resources here to help schools tackle the academic and socio-emotional consequences of this past year. So there's nearly $130 billion for K-12, largely going through the Title I formula, so disproportionately going to our highest needs schools. There's a requirement that at least 20% of that would be directed towards what we might describe at Ed Trust as unfinished learning, but issues or others would call learning loss. But the idea is that students haven't gotten all the instructional time they otherwise would have. We have early indications that students may have lost as much as 6 to 12 months of the progress they otherwise would have made, particularly low-income students and students of color. So there's resources here to address that. There are resources here to address socio-emotional and mental health needs. This period has been very difficult for kids and families. We know thousands upon thousands of kids have lost a parent to COVID. We think about the consequences that has for kids' well-being. There's $1 billion here for the Corporation for National and Community Service, something you and I both care deeply about. So an opportunity to mobilize, I hope, a national tutoring corps to provide intensive academic support for students, but also the kind of relationship building and mentoring relationships that make a difference. And the last point I'd make about what's in this package, or two last points. There's also a provision called maintenance of equity to make sure that states, as they take these dollars, can't disproportionately cut their highest needs districts with state funding. And there's a provision here that districts can't have disproportionate layoffs in their highest needs schools, which is something that we saw happen in the Great Recession. That was a really important additional provision. The last point is that in addition to the funding for education, there's the expansion of the child tax credit that has the potential to cut child poverty nearly in half in this country. So that's not an education program per se, but given the impact of food insecurity, housing insecurity, so forth on kids, it's a huge deal for us as an education sector that this bill, this new law includes that expansion of the child tax credit. It's only temporary. We need to work to make that permanent, but that has huge potential implications for making our society healthier.
Fantastic, John. And I think we may come back to some of those details. Biden famously talked about building back better. And as I was listening to you, I heard some building back, I heard some catching up, but Rahm and others have all talked about you never let a good crisis go to waste. We have extraordinary resources, almost a terrifying amount of resources right now. And I think we'd all think, oh, what a disappointment if we used all that money to get back to where we were. Because where we were, not good enough for low-income kids, for kids of color, for all kinds of categories. We know all the disparate outcomes. So how do you think about the balance of the build back and the better? I think this is perhaps the core question for all of us as we think about this. And I'm going to then turn and sort of draw in the panel around this same question. But there's a tragic possibility that we spend $160 billion to get back to where we were, and then we are exhausted and deflated by the fact that we haven't done something greater. So how do you balance those things? And think about who's on this call today, people in communities across the country who want to influence how some of this money is spent in their communities to achieve greater results. How do you balance build back and build back better?
Yeah, well, one framing point is that as excited as I am about the American Rescue Plan, we have to see this as the floor, not the ceiling of the federal investment here. And so we've got to continue to say to the administration and to members of Congress that we need to move towards that universal quality early childhood education, that we need to double Title I as President Biden proposed in his recent budget proposal, that we need to get to debt-free college for all Americans, and that is achievable in the wealthiest country that's ever existed in the world. So we got to keep the pressure on that this is just a start. That said, I think at the local level, we should be thinking about how do we invest these dollars in ways that are highest leverage. We just put out 3 papers at Ed Trust, one on targeted intensive tutoring, which we know has really good evidence of helping to accelerate learning. And that's not just to address the consequences of COVID. That ought to be thinking about kids who were behind before COVID, how we're going to restructure so that those students who are most academically vulnerable make major academic progress. 2, we put out a paper around summer and expanded learning time. And again, before COVID, we had a challenge of summer slide. Students who were underengaged in the summer would lose ground. We had a challenge of kids whose parents are working 2-3 jobs, aren't home after school. Kids need more enrichment time. And our argument in that paper is we've got to think about how do we invest in high quality learning experiences that are also highly engaging, right? If we're going to have programs this summer or summer 22, summer 23, they ought to be programs where there's arts and athletics and robotics and science experiments and things that make kids want to come every day. It can't be about remediation. And then we have a 3rd paper that's about relationships. And to me, this is part of what it means to rethink how we have structured education. I think we have, unfortunately, underemphasized the power of relationships, and those can make all the difference. A student who has a strong, positive relationship with an adult at school is dramatically more likely to be successful academically. They're more likely to stay in school. They're more likely to get to graduation. They're more likely to go on to post-secondary opportunity. I know this is something you've worked on throughout your career,
Yeah.
we ought to be thinking about how do we structure our time, our teams, our staffing to support the development of those healthy relationships.
Yeah, I commend to everybody all three of those papers from Ed Trust, and maybe Sierra or Sarah can make sure that they get posted so that people have access to them. But all of them, and John, you and I could go on and be extra boring about the importance of relationships all day long. I was so pleased to see that you all did that paper. I'd love to invite the rest of the group to turn on their cameras and their microphones here, and so we can get into this a little bit more. Patricia, I'm really interested in this question. I think it's the core question John talked about. How do we not just use $160 billion to get back to where we were, either call it done and think that's okay, or be so exhausted and sort of disappointed that we weren't able to do something more? How do you think about this issue of building back and using this opportunity to get someplace better?
Yeah, well, John, first of all, thanks for inviting me to participate on this panel, and John King for the incredible opening comments and the work that Ed Trust does every single day. I think in a lot of the polling that several groups have done, whether it's Learning Heroes or the National Parent Union, or just, Gallup, other polls, parents clearly are responding that they don't want to just return to normal. They want different, they want better. We're Excel and Ed as a policy organization, so we look at a lot of these things through that policy lens of what could be different. But I think there's also a school or practitioner provider lens. There were some really interesting things that school districts, charter schools, and others did during the pandemic, whether it was Broward County school districts partnering with community-based organizations for places for students to come together for after-school support, right? Whether it was Success Academy making decisions about having their best algebra teacher provide the instruction and other algebra teachers providing the support, or it was, there were states that put into place tools to help serve more kids through telemental health, or creating Texas, I'll call out for this, Texas home learning system where they invested in open source core knowledge type of content that anybody could use. There are a lot of things that states or districts or individual schools did that I hope don't go away, right? Even though in many places that are still doing online learning, right, there's an itching to want to get back to in-person instruction. There are, I think we've seen for some students, online learning was actually a really good, safe place for them. They actually thrived under a different type of model. And so I hope as we think about reopening schools, we think about some of these things that we've done, that we've delivered, that we don't just make them completely go away. We think about how do we continue to offer alternatives and innovative learning models for kids who thrived under some of these things. I think from a policy perspective, I think policymakers should also think about how do you create the policy environment to allow the funding to be used creatively, right? There's something that's done in Colorado called part-time public school enrollment. And it's a concept that allows school districts to get paid for students to go part-time. I would probably argue that there are some families, while they would never want to have to go through the pandemic again, they've actually enjoyed having more time with their children, and they have the capacity to have some more time and be more engaged in their learning. And they would like to continue that, but not full-time, right? They would want to be able to put their child in a public school setting, but still keep 1 or 2 days or courses where they could still be the provider, but not become a full-time home education, parent. I think there's so many things that could be done, especially on the digital divide. How many states and districts invested money to ensure that kids had devices, that kids had connectivity or a hotspot? One of my worries is that after we get schools back open, that in a year or two, that will all go away, that we will not maintain ensuring that kids have access to devices, to connectivity, so that they aren't missing out on opportunities that were brought to them.
John, I'm coming back to you because I've heard you talk about some of the things that Patricia just talked about teachers who are, perhaps particularly good at classroom instruction focus there. I've heard you talk about this digital opportunity. Alan, I'm going to come to you in a second because you said even before we got on, hey man, we're out ahead on this stuff in some rural communities, and everybody else has something to learn from us, just what Patricia talked about. But John, Patricia mentioned a couple of the things that might be keepers from what we've learned in this ugly year plus. So I'd love to hear you on that for a second.
Sure. I mean, I really appreciate Patricia's comments, and I think she's done a lot of work to try to lift up these positive examples. I build on that to say, in this post-COVID world that we look forward to, we should never again say to a student, you can't take this class because it's not offered in this building. And that is a problem in high needs rural communities, a problem in high needs urban communities. We've documented it at Trust, huge racial disparities in access to advanced placement courses, international baccalaureate courses. We see disparities in access to high quality career and technical education courses. But what we've learned during this period is just because AP French isn't offered in your school doesn't mean you can't take it somewhere, or just because the community college course would require you usually to drive 2 hours, but now we've seen that you could actually do it online. Northern Virginia Community College last summer used their CARES Act dollars to make 5 high interest courses available to every high school junior and senior in their region. Right? That's what we could make possible if we address both the broadband and device issues that Patricia raised, and we're smart about building high quality online course access. Another issue is, we have had opportunities to deploy talent differently, both in the way that Patricia described of a teacher who's the strongest doing the presentation across the group, but we've also had remote tutoring relationships. I think about Tennessee Tutoring Corps that Governor Haslam started last summer, mobilizing college students to provide tutoring to younger students. So those, you can't say there's a silver lining to a disaster. It was a disaster, but there were some learnings that we should carry forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's one of the things that the campaign really wants to do is to name what are the keepers, what are the things that we learned that we ought to keep. And a lot of what Patricia and John just talked about, Alan, you're all over, and sort of in a way of being both ahead and behind. So I'm curious how you think about this opportunity that's in front of us from the perspective of educators and communities that are not urban and not suburban.
But first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here and help the panel and be a part of this and have a rural say and kind of a voice on some of the issues. Far as I'm going to take Dr. King's line of unfinished learning. I'll go ahead and give a boost to unfinished learning. I think that's a good concept for a lot of rural areas where they may have been in school since September or October and had a hybrid or kind of a blended approach. And I think when we're talking about build back better, and I like how you pulled the better aside to kind of highlight the where do we want to go back towards? What do we want to do when this is behind us? For me, I look at the positive innovations that we found across the country from March of last year to now, and we want to take those and keep them. And we want to build those to make us stronger as far as how we reach every child and how we include every child in what's going on in our educational system. I think Patricia and John both brought in the fact of we should never say this course is not offered because you're in rural Montana. This course should be offered always. And I think that's the key. And I know it's been used to death, but this zip code issue of where you live should not be a hindrance on what's moving forward in your educational career. That we saw a lot of that, what we call a regional or regionalism approach, where the rural districts were sharing ideas, sharing teachers, or sharing possibilities through their remote learning, but also through their ability to share really pooled resources in a unique time. And I know April of last year, I had a call with a gentleman in Colorado, and he said, if anyone in America tells you that rural schools can't flip, rotate, and change rapidly, they are lying to you. We all did that rapidly. So that excuse is gone. So it's how we educate, how we, develop our schools never needs to go back to the traditional model, because why would you go back to something that we know didn't meet the needs of every child? And for me personally, and I have a ninth grader in high school, I look at the possibility of why should he have to go to the building 5 days a week when we have these other opportunities? It's okay if he goes 3 days a week. It's okay if he does some mentorship and working in a local industry or learning a job, learning what he wants to do. I think those are good aspects. So to me, the better is taking all the good that came out of the pandemic and the innovative approaches and keep those going, and let's drop list some things that are just not good. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Alan. Michael, welcome. Thanks for being with us today. Tell me, how do you think about the building back and the better part of all this?
Yeah, you bet, John. Thanks so much for having me. Great to be together with a wonderful panel. I would just frame two things. One that you mentioned, John, at the beginning. I think there's a major risk and a major opportunity in this moment. The major risk that you named is unintentionally, we could reinforce one of the most damaging narratives about American public education, which is resources don't make a difference, right? If we actually infuse this massive amount of dollars and don't deliver dramatically different results, people will say, we told you money doesn't matter. Or worse yet, they'll say, we told you this system was incapable of curing itself. Like there's literally no amount of resources that can help this system deliver a different set of results. That is the real fear for me. The opportunity is what I think many of us have always said is we can also show that resources well spent in the right strategic direction actually do make a dramatic difference. And so I think that's the opportunity here. And we have to make sure we get this right, because if we don't prevail in the second, we will reinforce the first. And so, in my mind, there are kind of 5 buckets of key things we have to be able to do well in sequence to accomplish the second, not the first. One is, I think every district is going to, and school is going to need to be able to have good and easy to use academic and mental health screening tools. So that when kids come back, you right away have a baseline to understand what their needs are. And that's got to be easy to use for every teacher, every grade level, every district, on both the mental health needs and on the academic side. And then coming out of that, we need to have comprehensive intervention plans for the academic needs that show up on those screens, comprehensive intervention plans for the mental health supports that show up on those screens. I think we're going to need to have a set of integrated supports for parents that connect what they're going to be able to do offline and at home with what's happening in school in those supports. And those also have to be easy to use. I can tell you one thing I learned from having 3 kids in online school is that managing 3 schools and 17 different platforms all at the same time is enough to drive me crazy. So it can't be that again. And then we need to have strong evaluation and accountability for those interventions so we can actually demonstrate the results. And that comes back to this opportunity to prove that targeted resources can generate outcomes. And I think what that enables us to do is actually build proof points of success. And I think we should be leveraging those proof points of success to get states to commit to then allocating permanent funding streams to this process of gap closing, because this should not be a short-term COVID response. As you know, these gaps were there before COVID, they'll be back and bigger after if we do nothing. What we really want is not just a system to build back. Building back better means we use this learning to actually put in place permanent infrastructure and resource allocation to close gaps all the time.
This is great. Mike, I want to ask you if you'll accept a friendly amendment to what you said, because when you did the academic side and you do the mental health side, and we know the kind of stigma attached to mental health issues. And would you say, are you saying child well-being, which is a phrase I heard John use, as a synonym for mental health, or are you talking more clinical mental health?
No, I welcome that friendly amendment for sure. I think it is a continuum of both. I think it is child well-being, and there will be a lot of it that show up as just general social emotional needs that are have been exacerbated or created by the crisis. I do think, to John King's point, I do think there will be, and we know there will be, some serious and significant mental health needs that are clinical, not just the loss of parents. I think you will see, we know we've seen elevated levels of domestic violence, of child abuse, of trauma from the economic impacts and the isolation. So I think both things will be true, but definitely agree with you. It's going to be a continuum of supports for child well-being. I think we have to be ready to address all of those. And I will add one other thing, John, is I think the real opportunity here also is, I think, to do both of these well, both the academic support and the full child well-being support, is going to require a different deployment of personnel than what we currently have in the system. I think what we know is our teachers and staff members are not ready physically or emotionally to be deployed again for a second tour. They've had as difficult the last year as many of the parents have. And to do this structurally, you're going to need different populations of people to push in and to buttress around the structures we have in place. So I think the ability to identify, train, support, deploy those personnel in a new way could help us unlock some new strategies and new partnerships to try to do this long term in a way that doesn't just expect teachers to carry all of this load on their own.
Yeah, totally agree with that, Mike. Thanks. There's a way we can talk about this giant amount of money and the challenges before us, and come up with a set of very smart but slightly generic kinds of thoughts. And I think that we're probably all most concerned about the kids who struggled the most before the pandemic, and who are highly likely to have struggled the most and suffered the most, both academically and in the circumstances of their lives during the pandemic. So I'm really curious about how you think about, you all think about, and I'll start, John, with you. How do you think about focusing enough, not only resources, but energy and focus on the kids who are in the most difficult circumstances, and who may be the most difficult to reach and the most expensive to help support?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to think about what were the factors kind of pre-COVID that drove some of those opportunity gaps, right?
Yeah.
And some of them are outside of school factors, and we're hopeful that things like the child tax credit can help to address some of those kind of material needs that were an obstacle for students. When we start to think about in-school factors, a few things that come to mind. One is we know that we haven't been sufficiently leveraging the science of reading, that our low-income students and students of color have been disproportionate in classrooms where they aren't getting the fundamental basics to support reading success. That is, they haven't been getting systematic phonics instruction, and they haven't been getting knowledge building and vocabulary building, science, social studies, the arts. And one of the things that happened, unfortunately, over the last 30 years is that attention to reading performance has led some folks to say, well, then we're going to do less science and social studies and the arts. And that's actually exactly backwards. Students need more of that exposure so that they have the knowledge and vocabulary that will allow them to navigate text alongside actual decoding instruction, which we know makes a difference for students' ability to read. So we've got to leverage the science of reading better. And that means high quality curricula, high quality teacher preparation. A second challenge, we have a real mismatch between our teacher population and our student population.
Yeah.
The majority of kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color, but only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. Only 2% of our teachers are Black men. And we have now a growing body of research evidence that shows that for an African-American elementary school student, having just one Black teacher increases their likelihood of graduating from high school and going on to college. So we ought to be thinking about how do we invest in diversifying the teaching profession. Kids all need access to well-prepared, well-compensated, well-supported, diverse teachers. And we haven't done that as a country. A third piece I would mention is the early start. And we did a paper at EdTrust pre-COVID, looking at pre-COVID data, showed that in many states, the percentage of Black and Latino students in high quality, state-funded pre-K3 and pre-K4 programs is in the single digits. We just haven't been doing a good enough job as a country making sure that students have that strong foundation. And I bet every elementary educator on this call has had the experience of walking into a kindergarten classroom and seeing a child who's literally holding the book upside down because they've had so little exposure to letters. That is solvable. We can do something about that by investing in early childhood, including dual language early childhood environments, where for students who speak a language other than English at home, we seize the opportunity for them to become bilingual adults. We see bilingualism as an asset, not a deficit. So, I think often we actually have a good bit of evidence about what we should be doing. We just don't always have the political will to do it.
Well, we now have, an enormous amount of resources, and I think that coming, and as you suggest, perhaps more, I think the risk is that we don't focus those resources in the way that you're talking about, and that either gaps don't close or potentially gaps even expand. Patricia, I wonder how you think about the kids who are most, have suffered the most, are the furthest behind, and are hardest to reach. Sometimes hardest to reach physically, are most disconnected, and how you think about the resources that the recovery plan puts in play might be deployed to reach those young people.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with what John, all of his recommendations are things that every school district or state should be considering, right? How do you build up these programs and the staffing and the services that are needed for these kids? I would say one thing that certainly influences the recommendations that we have to states or to districts is that sometimes you have to also trust parents to be able to figure some of these things out while the system is also putting some of these things in place, right? So, and what I mean by that is, the funds that have been provided, even in the most recent American Rescue Plan, school districts states can provide some direct grants to families. So in all the different situations that we've identified, right? Some students may need more academic support. Some may need mental health, like clinical mental health support. Some students may need social emotional supports. Some may just need enrichment, right? They've been cooped up so long and restricted in where they could go. Just being able to get out and actually participate in some type of enrichment activity with others when states open up, that's going to be of benefit. Now, for families of means have been dealing with tutoring, have been getting mental health supports for their kids, have still been, even if it was online, giving enrichment opportunities to their kids. And families who don't have means, even before the pandemic, were not able to provide these things. So one recommendation we would have is think about providing direct grants to families, because there is so much money available, especially at the local level, So for during this summer, for example, give parents the opportunity, low-income parents the opportunity to spend in certain ways, right? Just $400 or $500 per family for the summer means a couple of weeks of camp or several group therapy sessions, or the opportunity to get some tutoring in areas that maybe school districts won't have the time or the capacity to ramp up for. I've been on a lot of calls with district folks, school folks who have said, everybody wants to talk about summer school, but let me tell you, my teachers are burned out and they are going to need the summer off. So instead of, not deploying some of these things over the summer, there are ways that through direct grants, and think of it as, summer supports directly for parents. There are innovative things that you can do at the same time as you're building up for reopening and how to intake and serve these kids at the start of school next year.
Wow, that's really interesting. I'd be curious what others think about the idea of direct grants to families to support their kids'
with parameters,
activities.
right? With
Of
parameters,
course,
around
naturally. Mike, I'm curious how you think about those kids who are most difficult to reach. In another setting, I heard John talk about kids who've really disconnected in profound ways, not blaming those kids, but whose circumstances just had them completely disconnect from school and activities. How do we think about using the resources that are the extraordinary resources made available in this plan to really reach those kids and to help them accelerate their learning?
It's a great question. I mean, I think that one thing is, I just think a general investment in digital equity is going to be really important in this context. This is one of those things that was revealed by the pandemic, and some people have mentioned this, but I just give you a data point from Colorado. In Colorado, our estimates were that almost 50% of all Latinx students in the state of Colorado did not have access to either a computer or to wireless. And so that means, it's the largest minority group in the state, almost 22% of the kids in the population, and half of them probably couldn't access in any consistent way any online content for the course of the year. We know those digital divides are deep and pervasive. That means everything from broadband to actually devices to wireless. And so I think our chance to make really targeted one-time infrastructure builds in neighborhoods and communities where we know access to devices and access to wireless is not available, I think would be very high impact. I will say, to Patricia's point, we're deep believers in this. In fact, we are running a ballot measure here in Colorado this November to do just that, which is to say, we think the state should make a permanent commitment to providing access to after school and summer programming, which even if we do 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. perfectly from September to May, we know the summer learning loss that happens for low-income students because they don't have access to the kind of enrichment activities that John King was describing is going to be pervasive regardless. And so we would be, I think, the first state in the country to put in place a model like this where every low-income student under about 200% of the federal poverty level would have access to up to about $1,500 of resources they could use and direct over the course of the year to access tutoring, to go to robotics camp, to access art enrichment, or to take summer programming. And so we want to use this chance to say, yes, there is a short-term recovery need, but we want to make a long-term commitment to a strategy that's going to allow families to access these resources and use them creatively for the long term. And we think that helps build a better market of high quality providers who are dedicated to serving the kids who need them the most. So we think this is a real opportunity in your crisis should never go to waste frame to make sure we not just solve the short-term problem, but the long-term problem.
That's great. Thank you. Alan, I'm curious about from in a rural context, and I recognize that not all rural communities are the same. So you might want to talk to the diversity of those communities a little bit. But how do we use these resources to reach those students who were probably struggling before the pandemic and who've been most affected by the pandemic in a rural setting?
Well, I think you hit on a good point, and then all the panelists hit on the point about the digital equity and not having a device or not having access to broadband or some type of cellular connection. I think what we saw during the pandemic and what we're dealing with now is that has been a major factor, and the communities really in this regional or community approach of bringing in outside services, whether that may be faith-based or community organizations that partner with the school. And I think we need to carry that on to meet the needs of every child throughout the year. I love Patricia's idea about the grants to families, because sometimes we take it, we look at items that are just kind of like, okay, every kid can afford to do this, or every kid can afford to take this extra course, or whatever it may be. And I think the family planning and the grants, that the opportunity would be very big in rural communities. The other aspect, I think, just the engagement with others, and even though we've been in school, a lot of rural places, or they've been in a hybrid model, we've not been in the same engagement level as we would have been in the past. And I think the opportunities over the summer to do that, to be engaged with other students, to be engaged in interest activities, or to Dr. King's point, I think it's important about the reading, and as far as a strategic plan to address the needs. I live in Tennessee. Tennessee right now is really engaged in reading and doing some work to help all schools, and the summer is going to be a big part of it. I will say, what we're seeing locally and what we're seeing in a lot of our rural areas, the teachers are really in a spot where they need a break. And what I mean by that, they need a push towards maybe the August, September, before we do anything really big, bringing students back. Where my son goes to school, they're pushing for their learning loss or unfinished learning really to take place in August and start the school year in September. So it gives them that 3 to 4 weeks before they go back into the regular classroom. One of the things that came out of the pandemic that to try to address is we saw schools when they went back in the fall, if they left at the start of the pandemic in second grade, they came back in the fall of 2021 to do a refresher in second grade. Then they were on to third grade as the year progressed. And I think those were options that kind of really helped out. So that's kind of my take on that area. So.
John alluded earlier to the fact that we can really geek out around the possibilities of national service, and Mike comes out of a national service background. John alluded to the fact that the Tennessee Reading Corps. I'm curious how optimistic people feel about the possibility of a national tutoring corps. John, I'm going to start with you because you've written and spoken about this, but we also have people who are sitting in different contexts. And those for those of us who happen to sit around Washington, D.C., it's easy to sit around and think about, oh, we should have a national this or a national that, but it may look different in Tennessee and Colorado and Florida and every place else. But John, why don't you talk for a second about the idea of a national tutoring corps, and then let's bump around and see what people think about that.
Yeah, I mean, we argue in this trust paper that I was describing that we really have decades of evidence showing that a well-trained tutor with high quality materials working with 1-2 students can actually make tremendous academic progress. And so then the question is, well, how would you scale that? And what's appealing about a national tutoring corps is you have young people, current college students, recent college graduates, maybe students in between high school and college, who are looking for an opportunity. How do we match their willingness to serve with this tremendous need that we have to address unfinished learning for our students? Some of our international peers are doing this. The UK, for example, is working to stand up a national tutoring corps effort.
Yep.
We have this tradition around national service. We haven't fully invested in it. I think you and I would probably agree we ought to have universal national service. I would love to get to a place where everyone would commit to a year of service to their community. That for some, that might be serving the military, but for lots of folks, it would be working in education, mentoring young people, working to address climate change, right? So we've got these resources. Now we've got to stand up capacity. And I think that's our biggest challenge, is that how do we help the nonprofit sector meet this moment? And we have some national programs that are longstanding, like a city year,
Yep.
We have some emerging programs like Saga Education, which is based in Chicago, which has really good randomized controlled trial evidence of effectiveness in accelerating math progress. But I worry that we don't necessarily have the capacity today to meet the scale of need. You know, we have 50 million public school students. If you just said, well, we want to serve the 10% who are struggling the most, that's a lot of tutors you need. And so communities really have to be thinking in a collective impact mindset, bringing their school district, their nonprofits, their higher ed institutions together to think about how do we mobilize across sectors to address student needs.
Yeah, really agree. Patricia, I'm curious what you think about the idea of a national tutoring corps, whether it's all AmeriCorps or using various kinds of strategies. That appeal to you?
I think there's definitely, as John has identified, there's a need and there's supply. And so there's probably some way to connect graduates or soon to be college graduates who are going to be entering a tough job market with some type of opportunity to get matched up. I go always to a 2-track type of model, right? Where some districts will be capable of scaling this type of identifying people, of ensuring quality, of putting in place a system where they're running tutoring. But I also think there are existing for-profit or not-for-profit organizations that do tutoring now, and they know how to do it. And so either school districts should think about contracting with high quality providers. I think in Tennessee, the state is going to identify high quality providers that districts can partner with. I think the other thing is giving, again, parents the opportunity to find what may work for their individual child, because I do think that parents can seek out an individual teacher who only, wants to tutor 1 or 2 kids, in a certain way at a certain time in a certain location, as well as I have to put in a plug for schoolhouse.world, this program that Sal Khan has created, again, with he always has these really small ideas, right? And this small idea of free online tutoring for anyone. And they've developed a way to pre-qualify and ensure that the tutor can demonstrate that they actually can effectively teach. They've put in security measures, and there are some states that are launching partnerships now with schoolhouse.world. It's limited to primarily high school math, but I think it'll grow. And so there are many different ways to do tutoring. I hope that as the resources are deployed, that school districts don't think of just one way to do it, like that there are multiple ways to engage families, to engage current providers, and to think about how to build this into the system in general.
That's great. So I want to turn in a second to questions from people who are listening. And people who are listening out there, please put your questions not in the chat box, but in the Q&A thing. And Yoli is going to be going through those, and we're going to be putting some of those questions to our fabulous group of panelists. Just as we segue towards the audience participation part of this, I want to ask each of you, the people who are on this call today, largely are people from the Campaign for Grade Level Reading communities around the country, 350 communities around the country. It could be an individual nonprofit, it could be a collection of nonprofits. And I have 2 questions about how people in these nonprofit organizations should engage, like with those who are deciding about how these resources can be spent. So the one question is, like, how do you actually engage? What are the entry points for engagement? And 2 is, we often think about being advocates and driving for the thing we want, but I'm also curious about how community organizations can be helpful to those who are going to have to make a bunch of complicated decisions about how to allocate resources most effectively. So Mike, you've sat in a couple of different spots with respect to this question of the interaction of interested, engaged community members and decision makers. And I'm curious what kind of counsel you would give to the folks who are watching and listening about how to helpfully engage.
Thanks, John. I mean, I think it's an incredible opportunity for two reasons. One is that we know the schools and school district personnel themselves are totally overwhelmed and taxed beyond belief. So they don't have the time to spend a 5-day strategic retreat to figure out what the best ideas are for how they can deploy these resources this summer. So I think those people really need your advocacy on their behalf right now, and your ability to help engage with them and build concrete plans, I think would be tremendously helpful. And I also think the other people that really need your support are those legislators trying to figure out what to do with a huge amount of money very quickly. And so I think your ability to be the intermediary between those two organizations to help partner with the schools and districts to develop plans that are going to be highly effective for them based on some of the feedback you've heard today and others. And then the ability to go to those legislators, to state legislators, to governor's office policy leaders and say, here is what we think the 3 or 4 or 5 most high impact strategies would be. And here are the communities and districts we've been partnering with and talking to who are interested in doing that. I think you could almost make both sides of that match and bring the partners to the table with the proposals that you have in place and help leverage that for legislators. And I think it would be incredibly well received on both sides. So I think this is a tremendous opportunity to do that, and people would really welcome that involvement. One
Thanks.
other quick thought, John, to your point about national service, I just want to come back to. I think this is an incredible opportunity with the tutoring corps, and an incredible opportunity to change fundamentally one of the structures of national service to make it more inclusive, which is, as you know, I'm a deep believer in national service. You are, in military service, we have 2 structures. You can either join the Marines and you can be, 80 hours a week, 50 weeks a year, or you can say, you know what, I'm still keeping my day job as an accountant, but I still want to serve my country, and I can join the Guard. And in the Guard, you can keep your day job, but 8 or 10 weekends a year, you go out and provide service to your country. I've been advocating for a couple of years, there should be a civilian version of the Guard, which is a tutoring corps that would allow people to keep their day jobs. So it would be much less expensive, but much higher impact, to say you could do 4 or 6 or 8 hours of tutoring a month, or you could do 8 or 10 or 12 hours of trail repair a month, or climate-based support. But the ability to both expand the corps dramatically and to give people access to it who didn't have to give up their day job and have to expect the AmeriCorps to pay their full salary, I think would open up a huge swath of potential corps members who would love to serve their country in this moment, but don't know how.
Ooh, that's a red hot idea. We're going to have a whole nother conversation about that, Mike. Love that. Patricia, how do you think about how the people who are listening today can engage most helpfully with decision makers around the allocation of the resources that are becoming available? You talked about parents earlier, and I really heard that, and I know who's on this call. So I know what their interest is, and they want to be constructive, and they realize the pressure that people are under, but they want to be heard too.
Right.
So what counsel would you give to the folks who are on this call?
Well, I would agree with what Senator Johnston said about, being engaged to the appropriate actors and providing support and ideas and recommendations. I think one thing that everyone can do, because for the American Rescue Plan, which is the biggest of the 3 stimulus packages for education, 90% of the funds are provided to the local education agency. And so to give everyone context, for Florida, that means Miami-Dade County, which is a single school district, is going to receive almost $100 million more than the entire state of Florida's Title I annual allocation. That is a lot of money that is going to be going to a local school district. And so, step one and step two, I think, is engaging with your local school district officials and ask for a couple of things. Ask for transparency in how the money is going to be spent, right? I think districts should put together a framework for how they're thinking about spending certain portions of the funds and seek community input. So when you ask for transparency, not only on the front end of the planning, but I think on the back end, we're going to need transparency to understand how the funds were actually spent. That's going to be really important. And when you're asking for that transparency on the front end in the planning, part of that should be community engagement and gathering and collecting of ideas. And so as much as you all are engaged locally in developing solutions, I do think school districts are looking for good ideas and partners, right? I believe that they are. I also think we should all be a bit patient. What I'm worried about is pressure to get all of this money out the door by December of this year in some way that doesn't make sense. I think school districts and states are still going to be, we don't know what the impact is of all of the kindergartners and first graders that delayed starting school. Right? The parents just made a decision. When it's online, we're gonna take a gap year at the beginning of education. We don't really know all of those impacts. We don't fully understand them. And so I hope that there is a bit of breathing room and time to actually think about how to structure some of these things, particularly with the local funds, because there's so much. I don't know that you could wisely spend this amount of money really quickly. I do think it needs to be graduated. I do think it needs to have some planning so that school districts can adjust next summer after they see what they've deployed and put together and make improvements and revise their plans. So ask for transparency locally, ask for opportunities for public engagement. And you know, while you do want school districts to act, and our organization is a particular supporter of, especially as states are using their funds to try to get school districts to spend towards state priorities like science of reading, training reading coaches, putting in place good early literacy screeners, making sure all of those resources and supports about reading are there. We do want urgency for those things to be put in place and for the training and the high quality instructional materials to be put in place. But I do think there needs to be a little bit of time for thinking and adjusting as well.
Yeah, I think that balancing the urgency and the opportunity with the right amount of patience is extraordinarily important. I also think that we're going to need some patience with the results, and we're not great at patience in terms of public policy. Like, whoa, this is a ton of money, and we're going to get it out, and we better see results in like 20 minutes, or we're going to be disappointed. When it took lifetimes, generations to get us into the fix that we're in. So I'm really, I'm taken with what you said, Patricia, and I think it's actually something that people may expect, that there's public pressure for instant results. And if leaders in communities say something like what you just said, like, we don't expect miracles in 10 minutes, and we don't want to waste this money. Let's be smart about it. That could be very helpful to leaders who may otherwise feel enormous pressure to just shovel money out the door and not spend it wisely. I have a couple of terrific, I mean, I could go on forever, I promise you, but I won't. I have a couple of terrific questions that have come in from people who are watching. John, you mentioned collective impact. And that we're going to need some kind of collective impact approach to achieve the kind of deep, profound results that we really want. And the question really has to do with how much flexibility is there in Recovery Act funds, including the kind of flexibility that will allow real collaboration among different government agencies, the braiding of funding that we know could be really helpful, whether that's housing money or health money, transportation money. What do you know about those possibilities, and which would really support a collective impact kind of approach?
Well, the good news is there's a lot of flexibility here in the use of dollars. The challenge is for a collective impact strategy to work, you do need a convener. You do need that local leadership. And so whether that's—
We got a lot of conveners on this call. We got a lot of people who are listening very, very carefully right now.
It's good. I mean, you know, and you want someone who can bring all of the key constituencies to the table. I think, you know, the reality is school districts, especially school districts that are, you know, only in recent weeks reopening, they're sort of juggling, managing hybrid schedules, dealing with cases as they come up, planning for next school year, and they're just overwhelmed and stretched really thinly. So you'd ideally want a mayor, a county executive who says, I'm going to help bring everyone to the table. You'd want your university president. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to be the ones, you know, running the tutoring partnership, but you want them to be signaling institutional commitment to the effort. You want the leaders of your major nonprofits. You also want leaders of your local civil rights organizations, your Urban League, Unidos US affiliates, NAACP affiliates, who are going to make sure that attention is paid to the most vulnerable students. Immigrant serving organizations. One of the challenges during this period has been at both the federal and state level, not all of these resources have been available to undocumented students and undocumented families. That's a real problem. And so you want to make sure that immigrant communities have a seat at that table to figure out how immigrant kids, including our undocumented kids, are getting the services they need.
Yeah, Alan, I'm curious if you have thoughts about the collective impact thing. This is one of these things where we all say collective impact, and boom, the picture in our head is definitely of some kind of an urban community. And yet we know that this idea of braided resources, of responses that include everything from health to transportation to housing to mental health, all these things are often most effective for kids and families. How do you think about this question of potentially bringing together different streams of funding to really respond in the most powerful way here?
I mean, I think you see it sometimes, and especially if you look at rural Appalachian area, you see these community services all being brought together, because a lot of times the school system or the school itself is the largest employer in the county or city, and the largest employer in the sense of it's the hub of the community. So from that aspect of it, that's important, and I think with the pandemic, we've had the opportunity to really see this regionalism approach of bringing people together to do things together. I think this is the golden opportunity to take care and move that forward. I'm going to piggyback on the tutor service area. As a former principal, I look at the tutor service as a way to recruit future teachers. And when we're looking at all these services or these national core of helping rural communities, I would definitely find a way to connect with the ones that really enjoy the tutoring process and be a part of the community and be a part of our area. And I think that would be one of the benefits, that we really could recruit and find teachers. The other aspect that I look at from this sense is we have a lot of adults that want to be actively engaged in our school community and do different things. Number one, they're sometimes don't want to ask. Number two, they don't feel like they can really do a service to the help, and we're not always welcoming from the K-12 world. So I think this collective kind of togetherness, I think that's important for us to open the door. And I know you talked about transparency of the use of these funds. I live in a rural, small community. You really never get an opportunity to be this open about what's coming down the pike and how we can help schools. I think school systems that engage their community, from the churches to nonprofits to the mayor, to the county and city commissions. I think their path is going to be better as they move forward, as compared to going back to that siloed approach of, this is our money, we're going to do it for our school, we know what's best for kids, where we don't. And I think someone put in the chat about evidence-based practices. Yes, things that are working that we can do all together in community, we must push those forward, because we're at a time where we're never going to get this opportunity again, I believe. And this is a make or break for some rural communities. And if we don't adjust and change, we'll have some rural communities that will wither and go away because they didn't handle this situation properly.
Wow. So one of the focus areas of the campaign from the beginning has been parent engagement. And that's not just recruiting parents to be supporters of things, but honestly trying to listen to and serve parents. And John, I've heard you talk about this as well, that this was an extraordinary experiment in parents having a much closer look at their young people's learning. And as we come out of this, knock wood, we come out of this, how can we maintain that kind of powerful new asset, and also learn that parents have more wisdom than we might have thought about what's right for their kids? Patricia, you mentioned a policy idea here, and Mike was following that line and talking about what's going on in Colorado. I'm curious how everybody on the panel, but I'll start with you, Patricia, think about how the parent visibility into what goes on is going to change things, and might begin to change things right now, starting with how this Recovery Act money is spent.
Sure. I'm going to use an analogy that a good friend of mine developed in it, so it's not mine. But if you think about people who are in a long distance dating relationship, when they've been apart for a year and then they come back together, they're different and they have to relearn how to interact with each other. And for a lot of parents and students, they've been in a long distance relationship with school, with their teachers, with others. And there's going to be a kind of a figuring out how to get back together. And that's, I think, the opportunity that school districts have, that states have, of your question at the top on how do you build back better and differently. One thing that if I were a school district or a state chief with some of these funds that are available, I would look and identify ways that are maybe non-recurring investments in how to build better ways to engage parents. And one example, state assessments are something that our organization believes strongly in. We believe that we need to know how kids are doing so that we can better serve them, and so we can see where we need to improve and deploy resources. Well, one of the things when we've talked to parents in the past is that what they get, the information that they get on their own child is not helpful, right? We spend a lot of money assessing kids. We don't take enough time and attention in making sure parents actually understand how their own child is doing, or giving them resources and tools to support that. So something that California actually does is they've contracted with an organization called Spotlight Education, and they do personalized videos of how your child is doing. So you see a video on how John is doing, what John needs to improve on, what type of question John was struggling with. Here's a sample question. Here's where you can go for more resources. That is a tool that if states wanted to use some of their funds to invest in, so that when parents are actually working and doing the hard job of trying to make sure their kids actually take the assessment this year, that's a new benefit, a new tool that a parent receives back. I look at Chicago, that's been doing the 5 essential surveys for teachers and students, but they also do a parent survey. And I think if districts actually thought more about how do we use some of this money to build up better communications and feedback loops with parents, where they're getting more information, where we're actually setting aside time to communicate with them at the start of the year on how their child did last year, how we're going to enter the school year, what our plan is for your child this year. I do think there are funds that are available that can be spent on data systems, tools, infrastructure, just the plan for how to listen to parents better and meet their needs. And that would be a real opportunity that I think we could succeed in this year if we put our minds to it.
Great. Mike, I think I saw you nodding over there in the corner around what Patricia was saying about parent engagement here.
Yeah, I think Patricia said it powerfully. I just think this is a really great opportunity to figure out how we use resources to make schools more accessible and to link the work we're doing with parents in schools to the work and support they can provide with kids at home. I think it's a unified time on task expansion is the goal here. And if we have parents as partners and things that they can help doing with kids at home, I think that is a huge game changer, but not one that we've necessarily done well. I also think just having parents have a voice in what the best intervention supports are for their kids and having them be one of the driving constituencies to help us design these programs is also really critical. So I think for the capacity for the organizations on this call to be the ones that are both engaging parents and community members, talking to them, taking those lessons to the districts and school partners to say, this is what parents are telling us they want you to do, and then help us build a plan that does that, and then take that to legislators. I think that's a really critical part of listening to parents that could deliver much better results.
Yeah, I think, Mike, I love what both of you said, because I think if we don't listen to parents, they're probably not going to listen to us. So the two-way nature of the communication, I think, is really important, and particularly in communities of color where there's historically just not as much trust in the school institution. You can't just tell people all the time, here's what we need you to do, and here's what we think about your student. If we're not listening, we're not gonna get the kind of engagement we want. So absolutely. John, I wanted to turn it to you for a closing thought. I just wanted to flag for everybody that there's a poll that just got put up. It would be great if people participated in that poll. It's part of our continuous improvement efforts to learn what really rings the bell for people on these webinars, what you want more of, what you want less of. So please fill out the poll. And as you do, John, I'd love your thoughts on parent engagement. And then I'm going to ask Yoli to come in and close us out.
Sure. Given events this week in Minnesota, I want to respond to one of the questions in the chat around how do we center issues of racial equity in this moment, because it is often parents of color who are left out, whose needs are under-addressed. It is often kids of color who are left out and whose needs are under-addressed. And last summer, lots of school districts, schools, corporations, foundations, higher ed institutions put out these statements saying, Black Lives Matter, expressing solidarity with the movement for racial justice. But in too many places, people stopped at the statement and actions did not follow. So I do want to say, if we want truly to build a more just future, that means we've got to diversify our educator workforce. That means we've got to look at our curriculum and make sure that kids have opportunities to see themselves reflected in the authors they read, the stories they're exposed to, the history that they engage with, that we grapple with the hard things about our history, and that students have an opportunity to see Black excellence, Latino excellence, Asian American excellence, Native American excellence, that we take on discipline disparities. This is a conversation where we focus a lot on early childhood. Black students in pre-K are more than 3 times as likely to be suspended from school as their white peers, 4-year-olds. And so if a school district isn't tackling those things, and if their nonprofit partners aren't partnering with them in tackling those things, then we aren't really true to those words that Black Lives Matter. Right? If we believe Black Lives Matter, then Black minds matter, Black students' experience of school matters. And so we've got to tackle, again, staff diversity, curriculum, the climate issues around discipline, access to post-secondary opportunity. When I was secretary, we did a study that showed we have 1.7 million kids who go to a school where there's a law enforcement officer but no school counselor, right? And that means those are kids who, when they're experiencing trauma, they're sent to law enforcement, not to socio-emotional support. But it also means who's helping kids in high schools where there's law enforcement officers and no counselors, who's helping them navigate post-secondary experiences. So we've really got to look at our sector as educators in this moment and say, what is our moral responsibility?
Well, John, couldn't have said it better. That was really powerful and really right. And I kind of wish we'd spent a little more time on that today. I think that the questions and conversation about parent engagement sort of triggers some of those things, because we know how much lack of trust there is. And if we don't build that trust, we will never get the engagement, we'll never get the support, and kids will continue to suffer. Oh my God, what a great panel. I love all of you. I wish we could just keep talking. It's totally fantastic. So many good ideas, and just a big appreciation to all of you and to everybody who listened. And I'm going to turn it back over to Yoli to close us out.
Great, thank you, John. Well, thank you for being such a great moderator and lifting up so many questions and issues that are circling around so many of us. You could just tell by the questions that surfaced. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them.
Yeah.
And what really stood out for me in many of the questions is that people in community are really hungry to do the right thing and to really push their leaders on behalf of children to do the right thing this time. So I hope that you and others will be responsive to these community leaders. They're asking for frameworks, they're asking for tools, they're asking for guidance about how to use this moment in the best way possible to close these equity gaps. I love, John, how you started at the beginning, reminding us that this American Rescue Plan, this piece of legislation, is the floor. It is not the ceiling. It is not the end all and be all. It is not only what we need right now. It's just the beginning. It's the beginning of helping us think more creatively, more boldly, more courageously, especially around the racial equity issues. It's the beginning of investing differently for kids. I love that we surfaced the focus on parents. You all know this is the work that I lead at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. We think this is the moment that the silver lining of this very difficult year was how parents stepped up to the occasion by choice or force, but how much they've appreciated the role that they've always wanted to play, to really be connected to their child's learning in a way that often school systems push them away for them to be able to do. I love the reference to the keepers. Thank you, Ellen, for reminding us that this moment also brought other innovative ideas and tools and resources. Patricia, you talked a lot about that. Michael, Senator Johnston, you raised a number of points, and the work in Colorado, there were questions from people who wanted to know more about your legislation, about the opportunity to give mini grants to parents. So lots of great discussion, much more to be had. The campaign will follow up with 2 more conversations on this very issue of the American Rescue Plan. So we invite you to join us for the upcoming Tuesday webinars. So we're out of time, but thank you so much, John Gompertz, for leading the conversation. My good friend and colleague, John King, you helped frame the discussion so well. I appreciate you coming back. Patricia, Ellen, and Michael, Senator Johnston, thank you for joining us, for sharing your views. And with that, I'll close out by just putting up the slide on our upcoming webinars. I won't go through them, just take a look. Again, you'll see the upcoming webinars that are a continuation or a different slice of the conversation around the American Rescue Plan. We have one focused on how John King referenced this. This is the opportunity to reduce or end child poverty, hopefully in our lifetime, perhaps end child poverty. The focus on the 20th on the after school and summer time in terms of the resources in the American Rescue Plan. And then a webinar, pardon me, sponsored by Ed Week around what the classroom will look like post pandemic and as kids come back to school and the supports that teachers will need. And then finally on May 4th, we have a session with our partner, the Overdeck Family Foundation, on EdTech and how we might enable additional tech supports to address learning loss. So with that, we thank you all for joining. Thank you again to the panel, and we look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Take good care.